that, some of you have expertise I'll never have. And, we might start actually on that. It's kind of the front burner story, really, is the whole refugee issue.
I would suggest we just go around.
Sure.
And exchange some views, because unfortunately I do have a 10 o'clock.
That's why I thought we might start with you.
I can push it back a little bit.
No, but we don't want you to be late for things you're doing.
Well, as I mentioned to you when we were getting coffee, I spent 30 years of my career working on migration and refugee issues. And I'll just tell one brief anecdote. I was asked to come and give a lecture at the Foreign Service Institute. You've heard of that
I have.
organization? This was in the time of just after the Soviet Union collapsed, and the discussion revolved around what the impact would be in terms of people moving from the east to the west. And my first reaction when I went in to give this lecture was, who's going to come to hear this lecture? So this was when it was still in Roslyn, Europe. And I remember walking into the auditorium there, and they were hanging from the rafters. And that's when it first hit me. These Foreign Service officers really need to know something about migration. Did you do your time as you're an FSO? Right?
I am. I've spent the last 30 years as a U.S. government
So
diplomat.
you remember the consular duties?
I do.
So that was a surprise to me, and I held up a copy of The Economist magazine, which had the screaming headline on it that said the Russians are coming. You're going to have an exodus of people from Russia. And I said, this is nonsense. The Russians are not coming. They're not going to be leaving their country en masse. I turned out to be right about that, by the way.
Always good when you're right.
And the discussion was very intense. And the one last thing I will say about this is there was one very tall gentleman, obviously a diplomat, ambassador type, who waited and waited till the end, and he was still there grilling me. And I stopped him and I said, who are you? What's your name? He said, my name is Brunson McKinley.
Oh, I know Brunson.
Who would go on to be the longtime president of the International Organization for Migration.
Exactly.
So fast forward to today, and we're in another crisis. And this is a real crisis. There are crises and there are crises, as I'm sure you know. But when you've got 1 million people who arrive suddenly on your doorstep, which is what's happened to the Europeans, that's a crisis.
1 million plus, I think.
Well, it's over 1 million, yeah. The Germans have taken 700,000 or 800,000 along.
Yeah.
And we are taking, at one point there were over 10,000 a day arriving in Germany. Over 10,000 a day.
Yeah, overwhelming some of the smaller Balkan nations as well.
So, we in this country have said we might consider taking 10,000. And now we have this new debate, which says the governor's saying that they will not let a 3-year-old child, orphan child, into their state. So, as I was saying to you, this is not, we're a bigger country than this, and we have responsibilities, I think, that go far beyond, the panicked reaction of the moment. So I'll just leave it at that.
Do we, before you leave, I thought do we want to talk for a minute on refugee issues? Because it is a burning foreign and strategic policy. And can I broaden it a little bit? Because I often think about the world in terms of trends, not just relationships between two countries, but bigger things we're looking at. And one of those are flows of people, refugees. Not just what we've seen before this started of the coming to America part, this extraordinary surge to Europe, but also remember we had the unaccompanied minor surge from Central America up into the United States that was last year's big news.
That's right.
So, people fleeing violence in those cases, although not civil war, gang violence, poverty. And then you also have, in the part of the world where I've been serving, the Rohingya communities of Myanmar and Bangladesh who are unwanted. Citizens with no home. Vulnerable communities, kind of continuing the Southeast Asia refugee, vulnerable community thing. And I think the world has to figure out how we're going to deal with these communities.
I've given talks about this and trying to put it in the global public goods framework, so I can't give a lecture on that on the spot here today, but I do have papers and articles
I'll look
I can send you. So that's taking it, sort of to a level of talking about problems of international cooperation, getting countries to to do their share, and getting countries to understand why it's in their national interest, to cooperate and work together on these things.
It's not easy.
We all know how, I was going to say, we all know how hard this is. And, I think it would be good to segue to Josh because, what I would say is, there's always a four-sided game going on with respect to migration, and normally we discuss it in economic terms. So there's the market whole of this discussion. Of course, as you take people, you have to figure out what rights they're going to have and what status you're going to give. So those are the two sides.
And how long they intend to stay? Are these people who will go back when the situation resolves itself?
I'm talking about migration in general, not just refugees here. Refugees are a special.
Because some of them, would hope to go back.
But if you think of those two sides of the discussion, and then you see on one end of the pole is security, and when the security dynamic kicks in, and I know this is a bad pun, but it trumps everything else.
It's a very bad pun, but yes.
And then we forget that there's a huge cultural dimension to this. So the fact that these are Muslims, that you have this tiny jihadi fraction of the Muslim population, all of these things get conflated, and people are scared.
Yeah.
So this is what you get. So I'll stop there and let Josh tell us about security.
Josh?
No, well, firstly, thank you for coming.
My great pleasure.
This is
pretty rare that you get to sit back and talk to experts who think foreign policy and strategic issues.
It's about the best way to spend a Friday morning in November.
I couldn't agree more.
Nice round table, and it's just such a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.
So I guess we're talking about refugees again.
But we
I was all excited about TPP.
Well, we can talk that too. We can talk anything. Again, they're all connected. It's all part of America's position and strategy with the rest of the world, or lack thereof.
My view on this issue of ISIS and refugees, I come at it from a strategic perspective. My background is in strategic studies and national security policy, and this just seems like a bad own goal. Our response to what happened in Paris is frankly absurd on many levels. It turns out that none of the people involved in the attack were refugees, and they were all Europeans, and all 8 out of 8 were Europeans, and yet we're having this national convulsion about refugees as security threat. It's really striking to me that the fact that none of them were refugees seems to matter at all. But
well, people have figured out.
Be that as it may. So, but more broadly, I've done some work on ISIS, and I've looked at the history of the group. And ISIS MO is to try to cause other people to fight against one another as a way of increasing its own actually limited strength. Right? And it did this very effectively in Iraq and in provoking sectarian violence. It's done it fairly effectively in Syria as well. And it seems clear to me that that's what it's trying to do in Europe. And
well, that's right, because they don't really have another goal. They're not revolutionaries fighting to overthrow a dictator. They don't have...
Well, they want a caliphate.
So the simple rule of strategy is if your enemy is trying to bait you, don't take the bait.
The problem is you don't know where needs to hear that message.
Well,
Would you have thought governors? Maybe not.
I'll say it to anybody who will listen to me, but we've been energetically...
Professor, do you want to kind of jump up over here? You're sitting way in the back. Katie, why don't you switch chairs?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm not a professor.
Ray, don't...
We promoted
Katie and Renita hear from me all the time.
Don't blow your cover.
He's got a degree in Middle East studies. So
he'll have a lot to say on this. Anyway, keep going, Josh.
So so on that score, it doesn't make a lot of sense that we're having this discussion. And beside the fact that it's sort of disgusting as an American to see us violating the principles on the Statue of Liberty, but that's just my personal view.
Yeah, look, unless you're a Native American, every one of us claims our heritage, our background from somewhere else. We're a nation of immigrants.
The other thing that I've been thinking about is I try to imagine what will happen if the governors get their way. So think 5 or 10 years from now, and imagine a scenario in which you have large refugee camps and full of people who have gone through just terrible things and were denied entry from the United States. I'm trying to imagine what the conversation would be like in those camps. I'm guessing it would be angry, hostile. I can't possibly imagine the conspiracy theories about the United States which would take root there. So in terms of protecting homeland security and not contributing to a generation of people who actually might want to do violence against the United States, this is the worst possible thing you can do. Right? And the best possible thing to do is be welcoming, be serious about your intelligence and your vetting procedures, but we already are. And rise above what ISIS is trying to do. My take.
I'm going to go around the room. We'll come back, and I'll sum up my take before you have to head out. Do you have time for that for close?
No, it's okay.
Professor?
Well,
While we're doing refugees, we can then bounce around to anything else we feel like.
This was supposed to be about TPP.
And which I'm happy to do too, but again, it's rare that you get a chance to have a room full of
That's true.
national security experts.
We all are very interested in TPP too.
So we're happy to do that too.
but you have.
I was going to make a quick comment because when I
Yeah.
first heard about the governors, somebody had posted about the governor of my home state, Mississippi. And of course, he's, we don't want him here and that sort of thing. And it recalled to my mind back in the early 60s when they wanted to integrate Ole Miss, and the governor back then, Ross Barnett, said, we will defy the Kennedy administration, which is exactly what Phil Bryant just said, we're going to defy the Obama administration. I thought, wow, that's a terrible legacy.
Yeah, some of us are old enough to remember those days. No, I wrote to somebody, I've never been as ashamed as I hate to go back to the civil rights struggles of the 60s. I think when I've been this embarrassed by things that have happened in my country. And Ray's not telling us, but he's half Palestinian. And we have some experience with locking people up in refugee camps over a generation or two. Didn't work all that well with the Palestinians. And somebody else brought up the fact that the last time we did this was in the 1930s.
Wow.
And
Been a long time.
we turned the Jews away
That's
from
right.
our shores. And the speeches, if you go back and look at the speeches that were given then, they are eerily familiar. These people are not to be trusted. You're bringing in people who are going to undermine our society, who are potential enemies. Exactly the same discourse, but
That's the worst.
Astonishing, though, really, in a nation of immigrants.
yeah.
It's a little bit different if you're a nation of people who all look the same. You look at us all around the table, everybody looks a little bit different here.
Well, that's a great strength of this country.
It is, of course.
It's one of our great strengths.
Professor?
Well, so I also expected that we are going to talk about the TPP.
But we can talk about anything. But to miss the chance when we've got someone with us whose expertise is extraordinary.
I'm currently directing the Sunstar program on Japan, East Asia in the Tower Center, and that's so I'm originally from Japan, but I'm a China specialist. So I'm now looking at both China and Japan and the U.S. relationship with East Asia in general. But I originally started my research on Chinese domestic politics, especially political economy of rural China. So it helps me to understand what Xi Jinping is thinking about right now, which means he is really concerned with domestic instability. So one thing that I say that related to what my colleagues have said is we tend to forget that how stable East Asia is,
You said how stable.
How stable, because we
But
do
compared
not.
with other parts of the world, you're very, very right.
Right, and then we have some threat from imminent threat from North Korea, but otherwise, it's Northeast Asia is overall quite stable, and the Southeast Asia, considering there are so many developing countries, it's a very stable region, and it has been very stable region for a long time. And I usually argue that there is a causal relationship between the stability of East Asia and the presence of the U.S. troops. So I usually argue that the U.S. troop presence brings the stability, and that we tend not to be aware of it because we do not hear the problems. So this is the problem when we look at the world politics. When some problem comes up, then media reports it, and then we pay attention to it. But if we do not have a problem, then we forget about what we have been doing. So that's actually one thing that I say. Well, one more thing related to with my colleagues have talked about security issue. I have seen tremendous security implication in the TPP. And next Monday, I'm asked to speak at the Dallas Democratic Forum. That's the Democratic Party's organization in Dallas, and so about TPP. I think that I'm very glad to see that the international negotiation of the TPP is concluded. I'm a little bit worried about the American domestic politics, especially the Congress, whether Congress will approve the TPP.
Hard to predict American domestic politics.
But at the same time, I'm going to your expertise. That is, I'm very glad to see that East Asian countries, especially Southeast Asian countries, are moving faster than American domestic politics. So now Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia, they have expressed interest in joining the TPP. While three other major countries, Vietnam, Brunei, and Singapore, they have, and Malaysia actually, so they have already been in TPP. So that's kind of like my take of the both the security issue that we have been talking about and also the TPP.
Okay, Diana, you want to add anything else before we kind of circle back on refugees for a minute?
To be honest, I don't know much about the TPP.
But actually, or refugees, again, we're taking advantage. Starting with today's headlines.
I guess my opinions kind of go along the same line of what Dr. Rovner was saying. Being in the military, I've heard a lot of opinions from my fellow servicemen and women that have kind of made me ashamed. And I want to say it's a result of fear, or it's a consequence of fear. And fear can make us do and think and say things that we normally wouldn't as Americans. So I don't know. I think it's going to be a really tricky situation because it's really a balance of security and then the human rights aspect. We can't take out security from the equation completely because you bring over 10,000 plus refugees. You have to consider their safety as well because, you have a lot of Americans that are threatening, or that I've heard that have threatened to hurt any refugees that they see that come here. So it's not just American security, but it's also the safety of the refugees. So.
Well, circling back on refugees before we talk on other things, I think what's happened, we were talking a little earlier about how fast our world moves, the global interconnections. So you get an issue that 10 or 15 years ago, you wouldn't have had a governor speak on that quickly. But now the fact that the news is brought to you no matter where you are, every minute, and it's very hard to walk back I'm going to keep our citizens safe. No, that's sort of politics 101. And by the way, I think every one of us in the room is committed and dedicated to safety and security of citizens, and our refugee program certainly has an extraordinary vetting process.
Can I just add one statistic? We have since 2011, since the 9/11 attacks, we have admitted about 780,000 refugees in this country. 3 of them have had some problems, and they were brought in as children, and when they became adults, they contributed to some organizations, Hezbollah and others, which got them into trouble. 3 out of 780,000. So think about that.
And the numbers of Syrian refugees we brought in so far have been minuscule.
Oh, it's tiny, yeah.
So, again, it's a knee-jerk reaction that I think happens when someone hands you news and says, what are you going to do about it? And the answer is very quick. I'm going to keep citizens safe. We're not going to have that happen here. And then it gets hard to roll back. And then you get others who look at it and say, well, geez, my state's going to be safe too.
Can I ask you? I mean, you're a career foreign service officer. Your CV is extraordinary. If y'all haven't read her background, you really should.
You're very kind.
Can you talk about the differences that you've seen, say, 20 or 25 years ago versus today? Like 20 years ago, pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook, and all the rest. Something happens, a crisis arises. What would be your MO in that situation?
Yeah, I mean,
versus what you would do.
Yeah, but
today?
what's happened now is because the good side of being connected is we are connected around the world. And as someone who's made foreign policy my career, it's brought it much more to everyday American citizens what's going on around the world. Not everything. But I also think it's brought much of it, you and I were talking about this earlier, unfiltered, without context. Some of that started, by the way, when CNN was formed, an all-news network.
Correct. 24/7.
24/7. Everybody said it wouldn't work. It did. It's a triumph. And it's brought people the news around the world. But very quickly, very headline, without what we used to see, back before Diana was probably born, where, Americans didn't see a lot of issues, like a hotel taken by some form of now what looks to be Al-Qaeda in Mali. Americans wouldn't have known or cared.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
By the way, I probably suspect, despite CNN having this lot of the headlines, many of us would have trouble finding that on the map. But it brings you the news very, very quickly. And I think the pressure that puts both on our government to respond, what are you doing about this? And, local, state, business, others, and the immediacy now of the need to respond to questions that people can tweet you, can text you, requires, I think, an extraordinary discipline on the part of people who answer, which isn't always present, which is to say, gee, I'm still learning about this issue, like to save my answer till I learn more. That's not an answer you hear very often. And so I think that's the drama.
Okay, so for young people who are joining the Foreign Service now and they come to you for advice, would you be willing to tell them it's okay to say, I'm not going to talk about that now, I need to think about it more?
Yes, but there are some people who cannot say that. The President of the United States has a lot of trouble saying, I'm not prepared to talk about that, I'm not really fully informed yet. So, we can all say that. Or you can say, I just did a radio interview where they asked me about the situation in Bamako, and I can very easily say, it's still developing. It's fluid, premature to speculate.
You
Don't
can
have all the
look
information.
indecisive and not get hammered
But
for it.
it gets much harder, and I think it's doubly hard on governors and mayors of big cities. The mayor of New York is often asked about things. Doesn't have a lot of context, probably doesn't have a large foreign policy staff, but in our culture, perhaps can't appear to be weak, ill-informed, undecisive. So I think that's the hard part. I think for many of us in my profession, and you've seen others in government, it is often acceptable to say, still analyzing the information, still getting something in on this. At a certain point, you can't say that anymore. So, I still argue we have, obviously I've loved it, we have fascinating careers, we have amazing opportunities. But it does require a greater understanding of what else is out there.
No, the reason I ask is, I have a lot of reasons for asking, but going back to your comment about CNN, there was a famous story during the end of the Cold War where George H.W. Bush, as president, and members of his inner circle were frustrated by the intelligence community and frustrated by the lack of official reporting on events from East Germany and the Soviet Union. And they said, why do I need you? I can just turn on CNN. And so the question is whether you feel more pressure not only to respond publicly to crises, but to respond more quickly and decisively to policymakers, right? Where maybe the right thing to do is to say, I'm sorry, boss, I don't have all the information.
The first reports are always wrong.
Yeah.
Rule 1, the first reports are inevitably inaccurate. It takes some discipline.
Yeah.
And I would argue as an ambassador overseas, you are asked, we're seeing this all over CNN. Where are you? And the answer of we're getting facts, we're getting information, we're talking to people. You need to give people something to hold them.
Yeah.
As an embassy, we see it, we're working it, we're talking about it. Stay tuned. Again, that doesn't hold you for forever, but it does increase the pressure, and it increases the pressure on governments to respond. It also, the news cycle makes this much harder. You look at right before the Paris attacks, the president had rolled out quite a thoughtful campaign on what we're doing to combat ISIL on every level. The American engagement, the diplomatic piece, speech by Secretary Kerry. A thoughtful, gee, we need to inform people. There's a lot of cacophony out there. Unfortunately, 3 days later you have a terrorist attack, which makes it look like you really haven't done anything.
Right.
That's not accurate, as you and I know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that would have happened 30 years ago as well. You can sometimes, you can't stop world events. You can't predict them. You can't.
Has anybody in the security field actually studied this? Has there been writing about this?
I've written about it.
You?
No, of course you haven't.
Besides you.
No, it's a lot of people. No, I had an article called "Intelligence in the Twitter Age," and it dealt with this very question of how do you deal with sort of traditional information gathering when you've got this massive information.
Massive citizen journalists, if you will.
Well, that's one phrase.
So when they found that Syrian passport next to the guy, you didn't immediately leap to the conclusion that he was Syrian, that he had sneaked across the border?
My initial hunch was, why in the world would a suicide bomber bring his passport to the site?
Yeah.
Actually, that's a great response, which it didn't even occur to me. Well, unless I guess he was, a suicide bomber, good point. Unless you didn't really intend to be a suicide bomber.
Which raised my suspicions, and also knowing how ISIS operates, so this might not be legitimate.
Might not be a real passport.
But it also goes to the other problem I think we face today, certainly I face as a government employee. Once a story is out there, it's hard to walk back.
Right.
So once you have, I'll go back to CNN, from whence I also get news, is standing in front saying this gentleman has a Syrian passport. It's that story becomes sort of lore and legend, and it's very hard to walk back. No, he didn't. It wasn't. This was inaccurate. Everybody catches the headlines, and then you move on to your day job. You're looking at what's going on in Japan and China. You move in a different direction. Remember, but didn't that guy have a Syrian passport? And I think some of that you just have to accept. You won't ever. You can do your best to walk that back, to fix it.
It's the delicate art of staying on top of the news cycle without being overwhelmed by it.
I think I'll quote you on that.
It's on tape.
Yeah, exactly. But you'll have the tape, I won't.
We should go on around the table.
Yeah, exactly. We stopped. You're up.
So you didn't. So this is Victoria Farmer-Myers, who's director of our Tower Scholars program, and you missed the start of it. We're discussing the response to the refugee issue. We've gone totally off.
We went way off script, just for our own interest and entertainment value. We're returning to trade and Asia and all those issues, but sometimes you got to go with what the top story is.
I was just going to say, I just came from my class. My apologies. We just had a mock Congress in my class where they were trying to pass foreign policy. And, we had an interesting discussion about NATO and foreign affairs, and you'd be glad to know the aid package passed, but NATO got defeated. So
Okay.
troop deployment is gone. Aid is fine. So
Okay, good to know.
I wanted to report that out from our SMU Congress here. I actually am interested in asking you another couple of questions, but I don't know. I don't want to derail where you're going. I was very curious. Somebody who studies presidential congressional relations, and I was over and did a Fulbright over in Australia, and I did a book. I just finished a book on U.S. foreign policy, which I call Out of Focus. And I was interested in your thoughts about the fact that there's a lot of controversy about how this administration and how they've approached the visioning of foreign policy. Well, you talk about mini rollouts, right? There's this mini strategic informational rollouts, and then they're overwhelmed by these imperatives, right? So they look like they're being very reactive without being strategic, having an overall veil of that, which makes alliances very nervous. Obviously, in the Pacific, we have, even Australia has been very nervous about the way in which the U.S. has approached foreign policy. So I was curious about the strategic visioning of what you see for foreign policy going forward without a a Cold War consensus to keep us together, what really is going to be the nut of it? Right now, it seems like all the above.
That's probably true. I mean, part of it is, and I think this has been, you obviously much more of an expert than I, but this has been happening over several different administrations, where an administration comes in. You remember President George Bush, second President George Bush, this hemisphere. We're all about Latin America. And a number of us said, right on, this is our hemisphere, this is fantastic.
Governor of Texas.
Yes, we got the right guy, speaks a little Spanish, we're all in. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and, again, we are in a position, I think, now that there's no longer the Cold War, we're it. America's left being it and figuring out how do we respond, where do we respond, what coalition of nations is available to work with us. And those coalition of nations may be ones in which we disagree on other issues, but we agree on a specific set of issues that we can work together, we can deal with those issues. And I think it's made it very hard for us. I think you've seen administration after administration, and by the way, going back to the President George Bush or President Obama on Asia, you still leave members of your team working that. But in the public eye, the president is suddenly visiting Ground Zero in New York and building a global war on terror, or the president is suddenly dealing with Syria. And it's hard. I'll add to that drama. President Obama is today out in Asia. He's just finished our annual Asia Pacific, whatever APEC stands for, but big gathering, and then the East Asia Summit. These are huge events. They are dismal for headlines. Alphabet soup, bilateral meetings, which is two guys or gals in a room talking. The picture looks the same, two people shaking hands in chairs. And you're out of the news cycle in Washington. So you're starting to see this, well, wait a minute, it's the president of France out talking. Where's our guy?
Yeah.
He's out in Malaysia.
What's he doing
And this is the drama. I mean, I'd argue, of course, from my State Department hat, of course you got to go to Asia. You can't say, oh, sorry, something else has come up, I'm not coming, which has happened before. Undoubtedly will happen to any president again. But you can see the other side of this, which is, again, we are, like it or not, the country people turn to. What are you doing? And our electorate starts to demand it, our citizens. Where are you? What are you doing? And by the way, I'll add the complication that the good news about the United States is that every 4 years we have an election. We know that. I have served in a great many countries around the world where that is far from assured. It is an amazing thing about America that we know that every 4 years there'll be an election and we will elect a president, and there won't be tanks in the streets. It will happen. It'll move forward. The bad news is we start our campaigning earlier every year, and so it gets, the politics get meshed into this, I think, again, I'm showing my age, but sooner every season. And I was out in September in Vietnam, Singapore, and Philippines on a quick trip. They were horrified, stunned, trying to grapple with our presidential elections. Who are these candidates? What are they saying? And of course, they don't understand me when I say it is like way too early. Don't even start now. The good news about all this is we're going to have a lot of choices. Americans love choices. This is great. Second good news is they're raising issues. Citizens are interested. Again, this is good for democracy. But really, we're still more than a year away from elections. We haven't even narrowed down who our primary candidates are going to be. Don't get trapped into worrying about it. But as you say, the rest of the world does. What's going on? Their elections must be tomorrow. No. Elections are a year away. Focus. Stay focused. But, so yes, to all of the above. It makes, we live in a really challenging world. An interesting one.
Before I have to go, I would be curious about your thoughts on our pivot to Asia.
Yeah, again, I've spent the last 10 years working in Asia, and it's certainly where a lot of the world's population is, a lot of our markets are. You could argue that the most important relationship we have in the world on the long term is China. China-U.S., getting that relationship right is as important. I don't mean fighting ISIL and everything else isn't important, but in terms of bilateral relations, it's critical. So I thought it was actually very sensible and very thoughtful, very well received in Asia, of course. the bad news is, it's never enough. The president isn't in Asia every day. Can't be. It's a long way to get there.
You said everybody was happy about it. The Chinese weren't thrilled about it, right?
I meant everybody in the U.S. government.
Oh, in the government.
Sorry, I meant my everybody. Yeah, I don't think the Chinese were necessarily thrilled, although I'm obviously always an optimist, but I think in the end the Chinese have benefited because I think we have put our relationship on a stable footing where we've given the time and attention to the Chinese to talk about issues we agree or don't agree on. So I think they have benefited enormously from a more concentrated and focused. Well, I think the hard part is people around Asia are saying, well, you're not here often enough. John Kerry didn't join the president at APEC because he was sent to France. That's a pretty sensible decision. Somebody really needs to show up in the home of our oldest ally. So why have Secretary Kerry fly from Turkey out to Manila when he can fly up to Paris and the president goes out to Manila? But you'd be stunned at the number of foreign ministers we heard from. How can this be? You've sent your number 2. What does this say about us? So I think it's been a good thing, and I think we have, certainly on the security side, but probably also on the economic side with the TPP, with our security fund, we've done well with it. Could we do more? Absolutely. You're not?
No,
You're a skeptic. I see that look on your face. That's okay.
Whenever people, you mention that our allies and our partners in East Asia are always looking for more reassurances, and the hair on the back of my neck goes up when I hear that. Like as you said, we've spent the better part of 7 decades trying to reassure these countries.
Let me just tell you, it is never enough.
That's right, and supporting them with extraordinary military and economic resources.
It is. Repeat after me. It is never enough in their eyes.
The question is and you don't have to answer this, but the question is for American grand strategy: is that a good thing? Mm-hmm. Is it a good thing having a network of allies and partners who are utterly dependent on the United States and are never satisfied with the result? Mm-hmm. Right? Or is it a good thing for U.S. grand strategy who have a bunch of wealthy countries who continue to cheap ride on American largesse?
Oh, I think that's a little unfair.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think
how much does Japan spend on its defense budget annually?
Well,
it's a wealthy first world industrial power.
But that's actually quite misleading because it. No. But the thing is, somehow I agree, but at the same time, when you look at the Japanese defense budget, it doesn't include the budget for the operation of the U.S. Troop presence. So that is a different budget, and it's not included in the defense budget. So
the budget for supporting U.S. forces on site.
Right.
Fine.
So but that's actually it's not a small amount.
Their contributions, so for American GIs, right? This is not the point. This is a wealthy country that spends 1%.
All this is being recorded, by the way.
That's right. We're fine. we're this is a good and genuine discussion.
No,
but I mean I would tell you I hear your point. I mean I do think we get some very good value out of some of our, particularly our alliances in Asia.
What do you think is the value? What's the return for all of this U.S. investment?
Okay, well, what I'd say, particularly Japan and Korea are good examples, Australia becoming one, is that they are able to assist on more global issues. So, for example, the Japanese are very, very strong contributors to international refugee organizations. They may not have a lot of refugees who necessarily want to go there, but they can pitch up with the money to support refugee camps. The Koreans did incredible work on Ebola. Really, funded a lot of things, sent a lot of people. So we're getting some contributions in areas way beyond Asia. In other words, we're gaining us with some of them, I think, strategic allies that can take that relationship much more global. You're frowning. I can see that. You don't love it, but it is true.
How long are you here for? You're here.
I'm flying out after lunch today.
Okay, well, I got to go for a quick meeting. I'm
Okay.
going back before it's over. But
Okay.
I apologize.
If not, we'll see you in Washington.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great to see
Come
you.
over
Thanks
and
for
see me
stopping
in
by.
Wilson.
I would love to.
I'll give you you a card.
We'll make that happen. We can find you.
Okay, I'm in the
Don't worry.
Wilson Center.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you.
I may
Katie
be
will
back
follow with
before
you.
Well, I
Okay.
wanted to kind of follow up in a different vote from what Josh is saying about these countries that, it's just never enough, and what is really the return on our investment to the time spent with this very important relationships. But what about the time spent with, if you look up trade, just trading partners? China's up there in Japan, but the top two trading partners constantly are the countries that border us, Canada and Mexico. And yet, little has been done, at least publicly, to reinforce those relationships that are easily pleased. I mean, we're in one of the best neighborhoods if you think about who borders us.
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, we don't have any. We have issues with our neighbors, whether
Yes,
they're
but
trade or.
We have good, when needed, we know we are not going to get a fight from Mexico and Canada.
That's right. There's going to be no troops or tanks on those borders.
Exactly. If anything, there'll be from Texas, state troops going to the Mexican border. But so why the tip of today's is very positive, but I want to piggyback on Josh's. Like, when do we pivot to other places that also?
Well, we can't continue. By the way, it's the rebalance stage. It's not pivoting,
Rebalance.
because pivoting implies you've turned away from something.
Exactly,
So-
that's how it feels.
That's why it's accurate.
Like, thank you. And
But with
I'm not in the State Department.
Like, you can say what you want. But with Mexico and Canada, we have incredibly deep relations. Kind of not just immense across the U.S. government. There's probably not a week in the year when some branch of the U.S. government.
How many times has the president been to Mexico?
Several. Yeah.
Not at the same amount of times that he's been to China or Japan and.
I think so, actually. And in fact, both he and Secretary Kerry, they were the first to call the new Canadian government.
Yes.
Again, happens. They've already met, and the Canadians have been invited to come down here, but again, their calendar, they're getting their government organized. So I think it may not make as many headlines as people would like, but I don't think either of those countries feel we're not giving them good attention. I don't think we hear that. And again, if the President of Mexico needs to talk to President Obama, he gets through.
Related to what Luisa said and also Josh originally said, my question is, what country does not complain about the United States? And so the thing is, that happens. So the question is, what kind of complaint they raise? I would say overall, Japan is not complaining about the United States. Japan is more appreciating the U.S. presence and also U.S.-Japan relationship. Sometimes some administration does not appreciate U.S.-Japan ties, and that's why, for example, in 2009, Hatoyama administration was in trouble as a result. So I don't think that U.S. is. It's not true that the U.S. is not appreciated, and the question is whether it deserves for U.S. to do what U.S. is doing right now, and then to me, the answer is yes, because. U.S. Again, my argument is U.S. presence brings stability in East Asia, and then for the United States, it's better to have East Asia stable than unstable. It's very simple, as simple as that.
Well, yeah, it yes and no. I mean, there is an argument that the presence of an external power can stabilize a region that was unstable previously. We've seen this in Asia, we've seen this in the Persian Gulf, we've seen this in other places. The question is, at what point are countries independently strong enough to do it themselves without requiring an external force to do it? And the other trade-off in that is, even if you're correct that the presence of 4 deployed U.S. forces has a stabilizing effect, the implication is that we've obligated ourselves to the defense of third parties and put ourselves, at least in theoretical risk, of a great power conflict against a nuclear-armed China. Right? Is that trade-off worthwhile? Whenever I go to Washington, I'm always struck by the fact that people are falling over themselves to make sure that we reassure our allies. My response is, why? Right? Why are we so obsessed with reassuring allies who desperately need us to begin with? Right? If our presence is that important, we shouldn't worry about that. We shouldn't worry about reassuring them. They should come to us.
See, I'm going to take issue with that, because I think part of having relationships is staying in touch, reassuring people that even as we deal with today's crisis, the relationship is important. And, staying in touch requires a certain discipline. I think that's why you have your U.S. government and your embassies to do that. I don't mean it has to be the president who's staying in that touch, or the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense, but I do think now more than ever, given the cacophony of issues around the world, we do need friends and allies and partners to work on lots of different issues.
Do you ever worry from your perspective that a constant reaffirmation of the American commitment will encourage bad behavior? That people who feel like they have top cover from Uncle Sam will say, well, we can indulge in nationalism, we can do things which are provocative to our neighbors?
I hope not. I think we're quite clear privately with a number of countries. South China Sea's a good example, sort of pivoting to Asia. But I get extra credit points for that.
I like the rebalance. Go with it.
Rebalance. Again, that also implies you're taking away from somewhere. It's hard. Again, remember when President Bush said we're all about this hemisphere and the rest of the world said, well, what about us?
Yeah.
And the answer is we're all about it all, because we do need friends and allies everywhere. South China Sea is a good example, where we're not a claimant. You got 6 nations who claim the same turf. Never a recipe for success. You've probably written a book about that if you haven't. Somebody in the room probably has. And what we've done is try to keep bad behavior from happening. And we've been really clear with allies like the Philippines, less publicly, but, don't push this one. Nobody wants to go war in the South China Sea. So, we understand you're dealing with a domestic constituency here too, but let's ramp down, not ramp up. And we may not say that headline-wise, but we're very clear with these countries that we're not enthused about provocative behavior by anybody there.
Is that working? The Philippines have taken this to the Court of Arbitration. They don't seem to be ramping down at all.
The Court of Arbitration is not a bad strategy, though. Our view on this is solving these kind of disputes via legal methods, via diplomacy is the right way to solve it. The wrong way to solve it is provocative behavior. The Chinese are by far the worst offenders, but the Vietnamese and the Filipinos have rattled some sabers and pushed and poked. Is it working? Well, we haven't gone to war yet in the South China Sea, and neither have any of the parties. Okay, yeah. Is it solved? No. Can the United States, or should the United States solve it? Probably not. You got 6 different claimants. They're going to have to figure this out.
What's your opinion on the freedom of navigation operations that were just held a couple of weeks ago? So this was, for those of you who don't know, this was U.S. sailing a warship past a reef that China had been turning into a military base, essentially, through land reclamation. China claims it's sovereign territory. The U.S. says, no, it's not. It's in the middle of the ocean. We have the right to sail in those waters. The U.S. actually sails through the waters, but in a way that was sort of designed to be not terribly provocative, turning off fire control radars and so. So what was your?
I thought it was exactly the right thing to do.
They struck the right balance?
They struck the right balance. The Chinese reaction was predictable but not bellicose. And again, if you're going to say we reserve the right to sail, freedom of navigation in international waters, I thought it was the right thing to do.
You don't, because the criticism from the right on this was that we were too timid about it, that we spent ages determining whether or not to do this operation, and then we sailed as if it was innocent passage, right? Rather than treating it as a genuine freedom of navigation op, and turning up, doing everything you would normally do in international waters.
I frankly thought it went off pretty well. I thought it struck the right balance. Again, there's no need in unnecessarily stirring up hornets' nests. You just want to make the point and reinforce our views. Obviously, I'd say that because I work for the government, but I did think that. I didn't think there was any need. And again, we live in a nation where people do and can criticize openly and clearly. It's one of our great benefits as a nation. People overseas never understand that, but it is part of us.
Of course.
Dovetail onto a couple of things. Obviously, this administration has turned to the European Union in the TPIP discussions and said, basically, you need to start to pay your way in some of these advancements, which has not gone over honestly well with European powers. So the U.S. has tried to tell their allies to step up. I think the fact that China was quiet in this navigation is really a sign that China was like, okay, we're getting the point. Again, because of the line redrawing. But I really wanted to ask you the question about Secretary Clinton had made a point in her last Asia trip. Actually, she said it 4 times in her last Asia trip when she said, "We are the great convening power. That our power, the United States has the power to convene, and while we still have the power to convene, we must use it towards." And that's when she launched into discussion about the TPP. And the fact that economic statecraft was going to be, well, military and the force and power was always going to be underlying, really to build those alliances that are intermeshment. And going back to some schools of thought here in the IR community, have debated this for years about whether an economic intermeshment would create more stability across the world. I'm hearing a lot of discussion with you about creating those sort of connectivities, and that would lead to a. So I wonder if you could tease that out a little bit. Is that playing out? Is that something that?
I guess that gets us back to the TransPacific Partnership,
I'm
which
trying to round
is
it
sort of
back
where
out.
we started. So,
Trying to go.
I mean, I'll be clear that, again, I don't support, I actually don't affiliate with a political party. I'm a career government employee. I've actually happened to be a free trader, so maybe it's my profession, but you do see there's a lot more opportunities when you can open markets. I've spent a lot of time in embassies trying to open markets for American products, wildly unsuccessfully in Thailand to our enormous frustration. Getting American beef in was just a nightmare because they've got free trade deals, which are really market access deals, with Australia and New Zealand. So the price of U.S. beef was out of range for anyone except a couple luxury restaurants who would highlight it. But that's not going to pay the bills for anybody in the U.S. So I think when we can use our economic leverage to open markets, we do well for us. Does everybody like that? Absolutely not. Does everybody like everything in it? There's something for everybody in agreement, and there's something for everybody not to like in an agreement. And the more you open up to trade, the more people have to compete. And there are inevitably losers. I think I watched as we had our economic decline, I was overseas, and the narrative was the U.S. is gone. Can't pay their own bills. America's in decline, America's gone. There were some nations who liked that, some who didn't. We've not only proven them wrong, but the thing we have proven that we, America, do better than anybody else is innovation. And I would talk to groups who would say, well, America's over. Okay, could everybody's holding an iPhone, just please hold it up. Just got a question. How many people in the room are on Twitter, on Facebook? Where do you think those came from? So I think our economic power is pretty extraordinary. Our ability to innovate, to create entrepreneurs is pretty amazing. There are nations in the world who would benefit enormously, bring a lot of people out of poverty, if they were able to harness something similar, have the kind of rules of the road that we have that enable people to do that. Things that don't sound sexy anywhere else, but that America does very well, intellectual property protection. There's a reason people don't innovate in some parts of the world, and that's because whatever they build, create isn't protected, and we do protect. So I think this is where I get back to the TPP, which unites 12 countries, some of which are big markets for us, some of which now are small but may be bigger. It also gets to the bigger strategic picture. This is right in the rules of the road. And if we don't, somebody else will. I'll stop at that and let others chime in.
I think we have like time for one more question because we need to flip for another event.
Oh no, we're just getting started.
We're not booting.
I know, but they have to flip and I have to be somewhere else. So.
Okay, that's fine. Why don't we?
Anybody else want to chime in?
Well,
How about we have not heard as much on Southeast Asia or Asia.
well, then we are related to
China, how's China going to react on the TPP?
Oh, okay.
Seriously, it's
Well-
an interesting question.
Well, one
Because
thing-
there's some chatter now that they're a little bit interested.
Well, so as I said, and I started my research, my career as a starter, starting with working on China's domestic politics. So when I'm looking at international relations, I always say there is no single actor called China. So very roughly saying currently.
By the way, a little bit similar with the United States. There is no one
almost,
American view. We have one American president, but our Congress is a lot of views, and
right,
our
so
citizens even more.
almost any state is like that. And then, needless to say, that China is a big country, right? And then, especially on economic issue. But my argument is more and more on security issue because much fewer countries are fighting interstate war right now. So China is roughly saying that divided into the reformists and conservatives. Mm-hmm. And the reformists are taking TPP or the possibility to join in TPP an opportunity to use it as a kind of pressure for reforming Chinese economy. And conservatives take TPP as a threat to undermine the vested interests. And then related to the security side, reformists are with internationalists in terms of China's foreign policy, while conservatives are with hardliners. So I usually say that nationalism is not the primary factor of Chinese foreign policy. Nationalism is used by the conservatives as an excuse to take a hardliner position and then try to sway the threat to undermine their vested interests. And here, vested interest is based on the state-owned enterprise system. So China, for last 20 years, has been experiencing, Chinese domestic politics has been experiencing the battle between the reformists and conservatives. You may remember, and then that's actually somehow when you were born, actually. China has a reformist prime minister called Mr. Zhu Rongji, and he was talking about state-owned enterprise reform. He was talking about upgrading the Chinese economic structure. China is still talking about state-owned enterprise reform, and they are talking about how to upgrade the industrial structure from the relying on low-skilled intensive industries, right? So why it hasn't happened? Because basically Hu Jintao administration could not win the battle for the reformist side. So China. So my response to your original question is, it depends on whether you are looking at reformist or conservatives. Reformists like it, and so I've heard a lot from the mainly scholars, but then those who are involved in policy making. They say TPP is great. Mm-hmm. So we want the U.S. and others to make the rules, and then if China is given a kind of yes or no, China is given an opportunity to respond with yes or no, that would be great, and then that will push and empower the reformists and push the economic reform. But at the same time, we hear in the media, etc., they say, well, TPP is kind of anti-China coalition. They say that because they don't want the TPP to empower the reformists and then undermine the vested interests.
Great answer. Well, can I thank you all for your time today? Again, feel free to share thoughts and ideas with us.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Great. Well, thank you, guys.